Welcome to Stories Caf. I'm your host for today's captivating mystery, set in war-torn Brussels, where we join Father Brown and the bones of the bishop. Before we plunge into the tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Share your location in the comments. Pour yourself a comforting drink, keep an open heart, and let's unravel this enigma together. Chapter 1. The Cathedral of Shadows. The Cathedral of St. Lutgardus had always been a structure at odds with itself, its soaring Gothic arches straining toward the divine, while its heavy stone foundations clung stubbornly to the earth. By the autumn of 1915, however, it seemed to have lost the debate entirely. German artillery had gnawed at its western tower, leaving jagged stone teeth silhouetted against the ashen Brussels sky. Once a testament to eternal truths, the cathedral now stood as a weary witness to the brutal transience of war. Father Brown lingered in its shadow, his small, round figure dwarfed by the scarred grandeur above. His sturdy black umbrella, doubling as a walking stick, tapped thoughtfully against the cobblestones as his mild brown eyes took in the scene. Even in ruin, or perhaps especially so, the building held a strange majesty, like an aged king stripped of his crown, yet unbowed in dignity. "Padre," came a crisp voice, tinged with an accent. "You are the English priest?" "Yes." Father Brown turned to find a tall figure in impeccable German gray, approaching with measured strides. The officer's uniform was pristine despite the morning's damp, his bearing reflecting a military precision that likely governed his thoughts as much as his movements. Yet his pale blue eyes hinted at curiosities beyond the battlefield. "I am Father Brown," he replied gently, offering a slight bow, "though I'm here more as a shepherd seeking his scattered flock than as any grand emissary." "Colonel Heinrich Zimmermann," the German said, clicking his heels in a gesture both formal and faintly apologetic. "I've been expecting you. Your bishop's letter spoke of your concern for the English Catholics still in Brussels." Father Brown nodded, though his gaze drifted back to the cathedral's wounded facade. "Buildings suffer in wartime, much like people," he mused softly. "I sometimes wonder if stones hold their scars longer than flesh." Zimmerman followed his gaze, a flicker of genuine interest in his expression. "You speak like one who values architecture, Father. This cathedral has intrigued me since our arrival 13th century, mostly, though with Romanesque traces in the crypt. The stonework's remarkably preserved, considering men have been trying to tear it down for 700 years. Father Brown suggested, a gentle humor in his tone. A faint smile crossed the colonel's stern features. "Precisely, though I suspect the current wounds may prove easier to mend than some of the spiritual scars this place has seen." Before Father Brown could probe the meaning behind this cryptic remark, the cathedral's great doors groaned open, and two figures emerged into the pale morning light. The first was clearly a clergyman, an elderly man whose white hair framed a face that seemed carved from the same weathered stone as the building behind him. His cassock, though carefully mended, spoke of years of faithful service, and his hands trembled slightly as they clutched a worn breviary. "Ah, Permatus," Colonel Zimmerman said, "please meet Father Brown, the English priest I mentioned." It. Old sacristan's eyes pale blue and watery with age fixed upon Father Brown with an intensity that was almost disconcerting. "English," he murmured in heavily accented English, and then switched to French. "Forgive me, more in pair, but these days I find myself suspicious of strangers. The stones themselves whisper warnings. Permatius has served Lutgardus for nearly 40 years, Colonel," Zimmerman explained, though his tone suggested a certain patient exasperation with the old man's mystical tendencies. "His knowledge of Fey building's history is comprehensive." The second figure, Tomerch, was a boy of perhaps 12 years, though malnutrition had likely made him appear younger than his actual age. His dark hair was cropped close, and his clothes, while clean, were clearly thecastoffs of larger children, yet his eyes held an alertness that spoke of intelligence, sharpened by necessity. "This is a meal," Permatazin, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. He assists me with theater duties and knows every stone of this place as well as I do. The boy ducked his head shilly, but peered up at Father Brown with curious eyes. "Bonjour, Mayor," he said softly. "Bonjour, Emile." Father Brown replied warmly, "I imagine you have many interesting stories about this cathedral." Something flickered in the boy's expression. A quick, almost furtive glance toward the cathedral's darkened interior. But before Father Brown could pursue the observation, Colonel Zimmerman was speaking again. "We have been conducting some necessary repairs to the structure," he said, his scholarly enthusiasm evident. "The recent shelling damages more than just the exterior. Some of the interior stonework has shifted, particularly around the chancel area. We discovered that the bishop's throne has been compromised. The foundation stones beneath it have settled considerably." Carashas crossed himself quickly. "It is not wise to disturb the resting places of the holy Himmered superstition, old friend," the colonel said, though not unkindly. "Though I admit the work has revealed some unexpected architectural features. Perhaps, Father Brown, you would join us for an inspection. Your ecclesiastical perspective might prove valuable." Father Brown nodded, though Heffend himself, studying the three faces before him with growing interest. Each seemed to hold secrets, as surely as the damaged cathedral held shadows. The German officer's scholarly passion appeared genuine, yet there was something almost fevered in his interest in the building's hidden space. Old sacristan's devotion was unquestionable, but his mystical utterances suggested a mind that might see visions where others saw only stone and mortar. And the boy there was a mething in young Emile's quick, watchful glances that spoke of knowledge carefully guarded as they moved toward the cathedral's great doors. Father Brown reflected that buildings, like people, often revealed their most interesting secrets only when they had been secrets hounded. The damaged cathedral of St. Lucardus seemed to promise its own, though whether those revelations would prove comfortable or disturbing remained to be seen. Massive oak doors closed behind them, with a sound like thunder muffled by centuries of prayer, and Father Brown found himself standing in a vast space where daylight struggled against shadows that seemed older than the stone stencils. Chapter 2: Disturbed Ground. The interior of St. Lugart's Cathedral possessed that peculiar quality common to all great churches. It seemed larger inside than outside, as if the architects had somehow convinced space itself to bend to the requirements of worship. Father Brown followed his companions down the nave, his footsteps echoing softly against stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims. The damaged roof allowed irregular shafts of autumn light to pierce the gloom, creating patterns that shifted like thoughts half-formed in a dreaming mind. "The damage extends beyond what we initially assessed," Colonel Zimmerman explained as they walked, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant reports. "When the shell struck the western tower, vibrations traveled through the entire structure. We discovered significant settling in the chancel area." Brown nodded, though his attention had been captured by the sight of candles burning steadily before a altar dedicated to St. Lutgardus herself in wartime. When so many certainties had been shattered, the persistence of such simple acts of faith struck him as both touching and profounder. "Is where we discovered the problem," Per Matthias said, his voice dropping to a whisper as they approached the ornate bishop's throne that dominated the chancel. The medieval chair, carved from dark oak and adorned with symbols of episcopal authority, sat slightly askew as the earth beneath had shifted in sleep. Young Emile hung back near the altar rail, his dark eyes fixed on the throne with an expression Father Brown could not quite decipher. There was something between fascination and fear in the boy's gaze. If he were watching a place where angels and demons might equally choose to manifest, the settling was quite dramatic. Colonel Zimmerman continued producing Asmo electric torch from his uniform pocket. 3 days ago, the throne tilted nearly 15. When we investigated, he paused, clicking on Therich and directing its beam toward the base of the chair. "Perhaps it would be better to show you directly." The light revealed that several of the ancient stone slabs forming the floor had been carefully removed, bosing. A rectangular opening perhaps 4 feet in length and 2 feet wide. Father Brown peered into the cavity and immediately understood why his companions had spoken with such care. What lay below was not merely a void created by settling stones, but clearly a deliberate, crypt, one that had been sealed for centuries and only recently opened a burial chamber. Father Brown observed mildly, though, "I suspect that is not the most remarkable aspect of your discovery." "Indeed not," Colonel Zimmerman said, his scholarly excitement evident despite his attempt at military composure. "The chamber appears to date from the cathedral's earliest period, possibly 11th century, based on the stonework. But thickens." He directed his torch beam more precisely into the opening. Father Brown found himself looking down at an arrangement that was both ancient and disturbingly recent. Medieval bone siloed, with age lay arranged in careful ritual order. A complete skeleton positioned with arms crossed over the chest in the traditional posture of Christian burial. The bones were clearly burial, and the stone sarcophagus that contained them bore Latin inscriptions too worn to read clearly, but lying directly atop the ancient ribcage, impossible to ignore, was Amadorn photograph in a simple wooden frame. "Montier," Prometheus whispered, drossing himself repeatedly. "It is as I feared. The spirits of the dead airwalking." Again Father Brown leaned closer, studying the photograph with characteristic attention to detail. It showed a young woman in the distinctive white cap and blue cape of a Red Cross nurse. Her face was earnest and kind, with intelligent eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer with quiet determination. "Sister Marie Claire Dubois," Zimmerman said quietly. "She disappeared 3 weeks ago. We have been searching for her." The way he pronounced the word searching suggested complexities that went beyond simple concern for a missing person. Father Brown glanced up at him with mild curiosity. "A Red Cross nurse," he observed. "I imagine her work brought her into contact with many wounded soldiers." "Indeed," the colonel replied, though his tone had grown more cautious. "Sister Marie Claire was known for her dedication to her patients, perhaps overly dedicated. Some might say." Prometheus clutched his breviary more tightly. "She came here often to pray. Hesed, a good woman, but troubled by the sufferings she witnessed. She spoke of visions of voices calling her to serve young." Emil shifted nervously at these words, and Father Brown noticed the boy's hands were clenched into small fists. There was something the child knew, something that frightened him into silence. "The photograph was placed there deliberately," Father Brown said, though he phrased it as an observation rather than a question. "The glass isn't broken. The frame shows no damage from falling. Someone arranged this scene with considerable care." "Precisely my assessment," Colonel Zimmerman agreed. "But question remains, who would do such a thing, and why? The crypt has been sealed for centuries. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the cathedral's structure could have known of its existence." Prometheus's weathered hands trembled as he pointed toward the ancient bones. "These are holy relics," he said. "The bones of Bishop Arnold, who built the first church on this site. In 107 legend says he performed miracles, healing the sick, comforting the dying. His tomb was lost when the cathedral was rebuilt in the 13th century, and now someone has found it." Father Brown mused and chosen to associate it with a missing nurse. "The symbolic connection is rather pointed, wouldn't you say? A medieval bishop known for healing, and a modern woman dedicatito, caring for the wounded colonel." Zimmerman's pale eyes harpened. "With interest. You suspect deliberate symbolism rather than coincidence?" "I suspect," Father Brown said gently, "that very little about this situation is coincidental. The question is whether we are looking at an elaborate shrine or an equilaborate grave." The silence that followed his words seemed to press against them like the weight of the cathedral's stones. Father Brown studied it, face in turn, the German officer's scholarly fascination wearing with military practicality, the old sacristan's mystical dread, and the boy's carefully guarded knowledge. Other is another consideration. Colonel Zimmerman said finally, "Sister Mary Work involved treating wounded Allied soldiers who were attempting to evade capture. Her disappearance occurred at a time when we were actively investigating irregular activities in this district. The implications hung in the air, like incense heavy, with unspoken accusations and dangers. Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that the mystery before them involved not only the ancient dead and the recent line missing, but the complex moral landscape of a city under occupation. As they prepared to leave their chancel, Father Brown noticed young Emil cast one last lingering look at Theopond Crypt. In that glance he saw knowledge and fear, and perhaps something that might have been guilt. The boy knew more about Sister Marie Claire's disappearance than he was prepared to reveal, and Father Brown suspected that before this mystery was resolved, all Optum would need to confront truths more complex than any medieval legend. Chapter 3. The scholar's obsession, morning light, had strengthened by the time Father Brown found himself seated in Colonel Zimmerman's temporary office, a requisitioned room in the cathedral's ancient presbyter that had been transformed into a military headquarters crossed with a medieval scholar's study maps of Brussels. Shared wall space with carefully sketched architectural drawings, while volumes on ecclesiasticality sat beside official German correspondence. It was, Father Brown reflected, the sort of room that revealed a man at war with himself as much as with any external enemy. "You must understand, Father Colonel," Zimmerman said, settling behind a desk that bore the scars of centuries while pouring coffee from a military issue pot. "This discovery represents far more than a simple archaeological curiosity." His hands, Father Brown noticed, had passed the careful precision of a surgeon or a scholar, or perhaps Beth indeed. Father Brown replied mildly, accepting the offered cup. "Though I confess I find myself curious about your particular expertise in some matters. Military engineering rarely encompasses medieval church decor." A smile flickered across the colonel's austere features, and for a moment the weight of military bearings seemed to lift from his shoulders. "Before this war, I was professor of medieval studies at the University of Munich," he said. "My specialty was the ecclesiastical architecture of the Low Countries. Street Lugardi's has been a subject of my research for nearly a decade." Father Brown raised his eyebrows with genuine interest. "A remarkable coincidence, then, that you should find yourself stationed here." "Not entirely coincidental," Zimmerman admitted, his tone growing more careful. "When my unit was assigned to Brussels, I specifically requested Dorset of this district the opportunity to study these buildings firsthand." He paused, perhaps recognizing how his academic enthusiasm might sound to a man whose countrymen were fighting his army. "I realize this may seem strange to you, Father, but scholarship recognize and know national boundaries. On the contrary," Father Brown said gently. "I find it rather encouraging, though. I suspect your superiors might view your priorities with less understanding." The colonel's expression darkened slightly. "Military necessity takes precedence, naturally, but when military necessity and historical preservation can be reconciled." He gestured toward the series of detailed drawings spread across his desk. "These are my sketches of the crypt chamber. The stonework is extraordinarily predating the main cathedral structure by at least 2 centuries, Father." Brown leaned forward to examine the drawings, noting the meticulous attention to detail in every carved symbol and worn inscription. The man's scholarship was undeniably impressive, yet there was something almost fevered in the precision of his documentation, the arrangement of the bones. Troubles, Zimmerman continued, pointing to specific areas of his sketches. "They were positioned with deliberate care, not the casual disposal one might expect from a medieval burial, but something approaching ritual significance. The arms are crossed in the traditional Christian manner." "Yes, but notice the positioning of these smaller bones." Father Brown studied indicated areas with growing interest. "The hands appeared to be holding something, exactly, though whatever they once held has long since decayed." But here the colonel indicated another section of his drawing. "These markings on stone beneath the skeleton. They're carved symbols, not natural wear patterns." Symbols, as rendered in Zimmerman's careful sketches, resembled a combination of Christian iconography and something golder crosses intertwined with spirals Latin letters, mixed with marks that might have been runic pre-Christian elements, incorporated into Christian burial further. Brown observed, not uncommon in the early medieval period, though the church generally discouraged such syncretism. Precisely. Zimmerman's excitement was unmistakable. Bishop Arnorf was known for his unconventional approaches to conversion. Historical records suggest he was more willing than his contemporaries to accommodate local traditions. Some of his methods were considered questionable. Byram Father Brown sipped his coffee thoughtfully, and Sister Mary Clare, how does a missing Red Cross nurse fit into your historical assertions? The question seemed to bring the colonel back to present realities. With uncomfortable fours, Sister Markler, he said slowly, presents a more contemporary puzzle. Her work with wounded soldiers brought her to our attention several weeks ago. She was treating German wounded as well as Allied. Father Brown inquired. No, Zimmerman replied quietly. Her patients were exclusively Allied soldiers attempting to evade capture. She operates what we suspect was an organized network, helping wounded men reach safe house, providing medical care to those unable to reach official medical facilities. The implications hung in the air between them, like smoke from a snuffed candle. Father Brown studied the colonel's face with his characteristic mild attention, noting the tension between duty and conscience that seemed to pull at the man's features. Such activities would be considered treasonous under occupation law, Father Brown observed gently. Indeed. Zimmerman's voice had grown very quiet, though I confess, I found myself reluctant to pursue the investigation with full vigor. Sister Mary Clare's reputation for compassion was well established. She treated her patients without regard for nationality, when circumstances permitted, but circumstances rarely permitted. Rarely. The colonel moved to the window overlooking the cathedral courtyard, where young Emil could be seen sweeping the steps with careful attention. The boy knows something about her disappearance. His behavior, when we discovered the crypt, was telling. Father Brown followed his cats. Children often see things adults miss, though they don't always understand the significance of what they observe, or they understand too well and choose silence over truth. Zimmerman turned back from the window, his expression troubled. The photograph placement was deliberate. Father, someone wanted us to find that image in that specific location, but was it meant as a memorial or as a message? And what sort of message might it convey? The colonel was quiet for a long moment, his scholarly mind clearly wrestling with possibilities, both historical and contemporary. In medieval symbolism, the positioning of objects within sacred spaces carried specific meanings. A photograph placed upon the bones of a healing bishop might suggest he possessed us. If reluctant to voice his conclusion, might suggest that Sister Marie Clare has joined Bishop Arnold in his eternal rest. Father Brown completed gently, or Simon said, his voice above, a whisper that she has joined him in his work of healing the wounded, regardless of earthly consequence of her. Brown set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, studying the architectural drawings with new understanding. The colonel's scholarly obsession had led him to a conclusion that military duty would require him toked upon, yet his academic appreciation for medieval sanctuary traditions are just complexities that pure duty could not address. The presbyte's ancient stones seemed to press closer around them, as if the building itself were listening to their conversation. Outside, the sound of Emil's broom against the cathedral steps provided a rhythmic counterpoint to their discussion, a reminder that some acts of service continued, regardless of the larger conflicts raging around them. Father Brown reflected that scholarship, like faith, could be both a blessing and a burden. Colonel Zimmerman's deep knowledge of medieval traditions had given him insights into the mystery thought a simpler military mind might have missed, but that same knowledge had also revealed moral complexities that made his position as an occupying officer considerably more difficult. Tiberius chapter 4. Visions and whispers. Afternoon sun slanted through the cathedral's damaged windows with the peculiar quality of light that seems to carry dust and centuries in equal measure. Father Brown found Père Mathiasen, the Lady Chapel, kneeling before a statue of the Virgin, whose face bore the serene expression of one who has seen all human suffering and found it bearable. Old Sach Christensen's lips moved in silent prayer, his weathered hands working the beads of a rosary. Warren's moved by decades of devotion. Father Brown waited respectfully until the prayers were finished, then approached with the careful deference one shows to age and holiness combined. P. Methuselah looked up with eyes that seemed to hold reflections of candlelight. Even in the daylight hours, Samir, the old man said, rising stiffly from his knees, I hoped you would commend our things that must be spoken, though speaking them brings little comfort. I am a good listener, Father Brown replied, gently settling himself on one of the wooden chairs that served penitents during confession. And I find that uncomfortable truths often prove more valuable than comfortable lies. Matthias nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes focusing on something beyond the visible chapel. You ask about Sister Mary, Claret said, but to understand her fate, one must first understand this place, this cathedral that has sheltered souls for 9 centuries. Colonel Zimmerman tells me you know its story better than anyone living history. The old man repeated as if distinct the word for hidden meanings. Mate, I know the history written in books, but I know also the history written in stone and shadow, in the whispers that echo from the vaults long after the whisperers have gone to their rest. Father Brown leaned forward, slightly recognizing the tone of a man preparing to share experiences that rational minds might dismiss, but faithful hearts might understand. What do the stones tell you, PMATIAs? The sacristan's gaze drifted toward the main altar, where the afternoon light created patterns of brightness and darkness that seemed to shift with each passing cloud. Cathedral has always been a place of sanctuary, he said, not merely the official sanctuary granted by canon law, but something older, deeper. The ground itself seems to call to those who suffer. You speak as one who has witnessed such calls personally. For 40 years I have tended this place, Prometheus replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 40 years of dawn, masses and vespers, offlishing brass and trimming wicks. One learns to hear what the cathedral wishes to say. Father Brown nodded encouragingly, noting how the old man's hands had begun to tremble, not with age alone, but with the effort of giving voice to experiences that lived more naturally insolence in the early years. It was simple things: the sacristan, continued footsteps in empty chapels, the sound of weeping from the confessionals when no penitents were present. I told myself it was the wind, the settling of old stones. But he paused, crossing himself with automatic devotion. Grad, I began to see what precisely Per Matthias turned to face. Father Brown directly, his watery easedly sharp, with memory processions, impaired medieval processions, moving through these aisles at the hour between midnight and dawn. Monks in robes so white they seemed to carry their own light, carrying banners. I could never quite read chanting in Latin, so pure it mattered me. Poor pronunciation seemed like blasphemy. Father Brown absorbed this revelation with characteristic calm. Did these visions disturb you at first? Yes, I thought perhaps I was losing my reason, or that God was calling me to some special service. I did not understand, but the visions brought peace and not terror. The white-robed figures never threatened. They seemed instead to be tending to invisible wounded, offering comfort to sufferers I could not see, and recently have these visions changed the old man's expression grew troubled, and he glanced toward the chancel, where the bishop's throne sat askew above its violated crypt. 3 weeks ago, the visions became more urgent. The white-robed figures moved with greater purpose, and among them, I began to see a woman's sister, Mary Claire. I cannot best attain, Pashas said carefully. The figure wore white like the others, but the face was that of a living woman, not the serene countenances of the blessed dead. She moved among the medieval monks as if she belonged with them, tending to the same invisible wounded with the same endless compassion. Father Brown pondered this description, noting how the old sacristian's mystical experiences seemed to parallel Colonel Zimmerman's scholarly insights about the cathedral's story of sanctuary. Did this woman figure speak to Yonat? In words, the sacristan replied, but her eyes are myrrh. Her eyes spoke of desperate need. She looked at me as if pleading for something I could not understand, and always, she gestured toward the area where we the disturbed crypt. You never thought to investigate the area? She indicated. Prometheus shook his head firmly. One does not intrude upon the mysteries of the saints. Father, if the blessed dead wish to reveal something, they would do so in their own time and manner. Father Brown considered this response, recognizing the delicate balance between faith and superstition that marked genuine religious experience. And when the crypt was discovered, did your vision cease? No, the old man said, his voice growing even quieter. They have intensified now. I see the woman figure standing directly above the opened grave, her hands extended as if in blessing or benediction, but her face, he shuddered slightly, her face shows neither thepis of the dead, nor the simple worry of the living, but something between. Asif, she exists in that terrible space between one state and the other. Chapel fell silent, except for the distant sound of wind through the Damagetor. Father Brown studied the old sacristan's face, seeing there the marks of a man who had lived too long in proximity to mysteries beyond ordinary comprehension. Prometheus, he said gently, do you believe Sister Marie Claire is dead? The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the statue of the Virgin. I believe, he said finally, that she has joined the eternal procession Aptos, who serve the wounded and the suffering, whether that service continues in this world or then next. He spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. The visions do not make such distinctions clear. Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that he had hard testimony to something that transcended simple categories of truth and falsehood. Old sacristan's mystical experiences, whether born of supernatural insight or profound sympathy of a lifetime spent in service, had revealed connections between past and present that mere investigation might never uncover. As they sat in the peaceful dimness of the Lady Chapel, Father Brown reflected that the greatest mysteries often lay not in what could be seen and measured, but in the spaces between seeing and believing, between what wasn't, what might yet come to pass. P. Matthias had spent 40 years learning to listen to toxic spaces, and his testimony suggested that Sister Mary Claire's fate was woven into patterns far older and more complex than a simple word of mad appearance. Chapter 5, The Boy Who Saw Angels. Father Brown had always maintained that children possessed a peculiar gift for seeing truth unadorned by the elaborate ambitions that adults constructed around inconvenient realities. It was with this conviction in mind that he sought out young Emil in the cathedral's small bell tower, where the boy had retreated after completing his evening duties. The tower, damaged though it was, still offered a view of Brussels that encompassed both the graceful spires of undamaged churches and the harsh geometric lines of military encampments. Emil sat on a wooden crate that had once held candles, his thin legs over the edge as he gazed out through a gap torn in the ancient Stonesby German artillery. His dark hair caught the last rays of autumn sunlight, and his profile showed the sharp angles that hunger carved into young faces during wartime. Yet his eyes, when he turned to acknowledge Father Brown's approach, held a depth that suggested experiences far beyond his 12 years bondsworn meal. Father Brown said, quietly settling himself on another crate, with the careful movements of a man mindful of both his dignity and the precarious nature of war-damaged masonry. Bondsworth Myrrh. The boy replied, thou. His gaze quickly returned to the window. I come here to think, the Colonel says. Thinking too much makes boys melancholy, but Pasha says thinking isho, we understand. God's will. Both observations contain wisdom, Father Brown replied mildly, though I suspect your current thoughts concern more earthly matters than Divinuel. Emil's hands, Father Brown noticed, were clenched tightly in his lap, not with the casual nervousness of childhood, but with the deliberate tension of someone guarding a secret. Too large for young shoulders to bear easily. The colonel asked me about Sister Marie Claire again today. Emile said finally. He speaks very gently, but high sighs are not gentle. They are the eyes of a man who must find answers, even when answers will cause pain. And do you have answers that might cause pain? The boy was quiet for a long moment, studying the cityscape below, as if it might offer guidance. Sister Marie Claire was kind-toned. He said eventually, when the other children called me Orinder and threw stones, she would bandage my cuts and give me bread. She never asked questions about where I lived or why I had no family. She simply saw hunger and fed it. Father Brown nodded, recognizing the particular loyalty that acts of simple kindness could inspire in children who had to expect little from the adult world. Such kindness creates bonds that transcend ordinary obligations. Yes, said his voice, growing stronger. That is why I must be careful with my words. The colonel is not evil. I have seen evil men, and he is not one of them, but he serves a cause that would punish Sister Marie Claire's kindness. Asterton. The precision of this observation struck Father Brown as remarkable. The boy had grasped moral complexities that often escaped adult minds entirely. You spoke of seeing Anglesbury bones, Father Brown said gently. Would you tell me more about this vision? Emile turned to face him directly, and Father Brown saw fear war with trust in the child's expression. It was not angels as P. Matthias describes them in his stories. He said, these were angels who wore the white robes of healing, not the golden vestments of heaven. Human angels, then perhaps. The boy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was very late at the hour, when even the German sentries grow drowsy at their posts. I could not sleep because my stomach was empty, so I came to the cathedral to pray for patience with hunger. That is when I saw the white figures moving in the chancel. Father Brown waited, patient lyricogging. That rushed questioning would likely frighten the boy into silence. There were 3 of them. Emile continued to carry what looked like bundles wrapped in white cloth bundles, the size gift. He paused as if reluctant to complete the thought. The size of a person, Emile entered reluctantly. The 3rd figure directed them where to place their burden. This one moved with authority like Sister Marie Claire. When she tended the wounded, quick, certain movements that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done and the burial itself. What? Did you observe the boy's hands clenched tighter? They did not bury the bundles there. They placed them carefully in the crypt beneath the bishop's throne. The same crypt we discovered 3 days ago. Buffy arranged the old bones around the bundles, as if he struggled forwards, as if creating a shrine. Yes, as if they were making a holy placenat, a grave. The bones were positioned like guardians, like the stone saints. Wowage over the cathedral doors. And then, Emile's voice grew ubiquitous. Then, the one who directed the others took something from beneath her robes and placed it among the bones. Father Brown's pulse quickened slightly, though he maintained his calm exterior. Her robes. You could tell this figure was a woman, the way she moved. Emile said simply, women move differently than men, even when they try to hide it. And Wench leaned over the crypt. I saw her face in the candlelight. It was Sister Marie Claire. The revelation hung in the air between them like the sound of a bell struck once and allowed to fade in tasselance. Father Brown studied the boy's face, seeing there the burden of knowledge that was both precious and dangerous. And after the ceremony, what became of Sister Marie Claire and her companions? Emile shook his head. They disappeared into the shadows of the cathedral. I waited until dawn, but I never saw them leave. It was as if the stones themselves had swallowed them. Father Brown pondered this, recognizing in it elements that supported both Permea's mystical interpretation and Colonel Zimmerman's practical concerns. The boy had witnessed something that was simultaneously supernatural and entirely human, a ritual that honored ancient traditions while serving contemporaneous. Emile, he said gently, do you believe Sister Marie Claire is alive? The boy turned back to the window, where the last light of day was fading into the blue darkness of wartime Brussels. I believe, he said slowly, that she has found a way to continue her work of healing, even when the world believes her work is finished. Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that he had received perhaps the most crucial piece of testimony in the entire mystery. The boy had seen not a burial, but a transformation, not an ending, but a carefully orchestrated beginning of something that transcended the usual boundaries between life and death, between service that could be seen and service that must remain hidden. As they sat in the gathering darkness of the damaged tower, Father Brown reflected that truth often revealed itself most clearly to those who had learned to see with eyes unclouded by adult assumptions about what was possible and what was not. Young Emile had witnessed a miracle of the most practical sort, the kind that preserved life by appearing to celebrate death and continued healing by embracing the appearance of lost captors' sex. The missing nurse, the next morning, found Father Brown in the narrow streets that surrounded the cathedral streets, where the medieval stones seemed to whisper off scripts as old as the first Christian martyrs and as fresh as yesterday's acts of clandestine mercy. He had risen early, driven by the peculiar restlessness that overtakes a detective when scattered pieces of truth begin to form a pattern, one that promises to be both more beautiful and more dangerous than initially suspected. This first visit was to Madame Frances Delacroix, a widow whose modest house on Rue de Martier bore the subtle signs of Gentile poverty made more acute by wartime deprivations. She received him in a parlor where fate had photographs of her late husband, a doctor who had died in the early months of the war, shared space with medical texts that suggested the household's continuing connection to the healing arts. Sister Mary Claire, Madame de Quay repeated, her weathered hands folding carefully in her lap. Ah, Mère, that name brings both comfort and pain to this house. She was known to you personally, Father Brown inquired gently, settling into a chair that had seen better decades but still maintained its dignity. Known to us, she saved my grandson's life. The elderly woman replied, her voice carrying the particular intensity of gratitude mixed with grief. Paul, my daughter's boy, was wounded when the Germans first entered the city. A piece of shrapnel in his shoulder, nothing that would ordinarily prove fatal, but the official hospitals. She gestured helplessly. The official hospitals were reserved for German wounded. Father Brown completed with understanding precisely. For 3 days Paul burned with fever while we watched him grow weaker. The neighborhood doctor had been conscripted, and we had no morphine, no proper bandages, no knowledge of how to extract metal from flesh without causing greater harm. Madame Delacroix paused, crossing herself with automatic devotion. Then Sister Mary Claire appeared at our door like an answer to prayer. Father Brown leaned forward with interest. How did she know of your grandson's condition? That was the remarkable thing, the widow replied. She said she had heard of our need from a friend who watches over this suffering. I never learned who this friend might be, but Sister Mary Claire seemed to know exactly where help was most desperately required, and her treatment of your grandson. Madame Delacroix's eyes brightened with the memorish, worked through the night, extracting the shrapnel with instruments that seemed to appear from nowhere. Her skill was extraordinary, Paul later said. She moved like a surgeon who had performed shock operations hundreds of times. But more than her skill, it was her manner. The old woman paused, searching for adequate words. Her manner. She spoke to Paul throughout the operation, not medical instructions, but words of comfort. She told him stories of St. Lucatus, how the blessed saint had healed the wounded during her earthly life. She made Paul believe that healing was part of some greater pattern of mercy that stretched back through centuries. Father Brown nodded thoughtfully, and afterward did Sister Marie Clara continued to visit. She returned twice to check Paul's progress. Madame Delacroix said, but by then understood that we were not her only concern. She spoke of other wounded souls who required her attention, not just physical wounds, but the spiritual injuries that war inflicts upon innocent, other wounded souls. The widow lowered her voice considerately. Allied soldiers, impaired men who had escaped German capture, but were too injured to reach safety without assistance. Sister Marie Claire operate what we came to understand was an entire network of mercy. Father Brown absorbed this information with characteristic.com, though his mind was rapidly connecting patterns that had unrelated. This network didn't operate from the cathedral partly. Madame de Lacca confirmed Sister Marie Claire spoke of the cathedral as a place where wounded souls could find sanctuary, just as they had in medieval times. She said the stones themselves remembered their due-to shelter the helpless. A romantic notion, Father Brown observed, mildly perhaps, viewed effective through her network. Dozens of wounded men found safe passage to friendly territory. She used her medical credentials to move freely through Thessaly, her religious habits to gain access to places others could not reach, and her knowledge of the cathedral's hidden spaces to provide temporary shelter. Father Brown considered the implications for this revelation. Such activities would have required considerable resources, medical, supplies, food, contacts with resistance networks. Indeed, Sister Marie Claire once mentioned that her work was supported by those who understood that healing transcends political boundaries. Madame Decqua's expression grew troubled, but in recent weeks, her visits became more hurried, more anxious. She spoke of growing German suspicion, of investigations that were drawing closer to the truth. She feared discovery. She feared for others more than herself. The widow replied her greatest concern was her capture might compromise the safety of those who had helped her families, like ours, who had sheltered wounded soldiers, clergy, who had provided sanctuary, merchants, who had supplied medical necessities. Father Brown rose from his chair with sudden understanding. She spoke of these fears in her final visits. Her last visit was 3 weeks ago, Madame Decqua said. Sadly, she came to check on Paul one final time, but also to warn us. She said that if anything should happen to her, we must remember that sometimes the greatest mercy appears in the guise of the greatest tragedy. Curious phrasing, Father Brown observed. I thought so at the time, but she insisted that we must not mourn overmuch if we heard news of her death, because death itself might prove to be merely another form absent. The old woman shook her head slowly. I confess I did not understand her. Meaning, then I understand it little better now, Father. Brown moved to the window looking the street where ordinary citizens pursued their daily struggles against the backdrop of military occupation. The pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. Sister Marie Claire had not simply disappeared but had deliberately orchestrated her apparent demise to protect her network while continuing her work under deeper cover. Madame Decqua, he said gently, if Sister Marie Claire were to contact you today, would you assist her, despite the official reports of her death? Poirot's answer came without hesitation, without question. Mara death or no death, official reports or no reports, that woman earned the loyalty of every soul she touched. If she has found a way to continue her work from beyond the grave, then perhaps the saints have truly returned to walk among us. Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that he had uncovered not merely a network of resistance, but something approaching a religious movement, one that viewed Sister Marie Claire's humanitarian work as a continuation of medieval sanctuary and healing. The photograph in the crypt was not a memorial to Thenet, but a declaration that such work continued, regardless of earthly circumstance. As he prepared to leave, Father Brown reflected that the most effective deceptions were often those that told a deeper truth than the surface facts. They concealed Sister Marie Claire's apparent death had become the means by which her actual life could continue serving purposes larger than individual survival. The mystery was solving itself, but the solution raised questions about the nature of service, sacrifice, and the thin line between earthly duty and heaven-like link. Chapter 7, Sanctuary and Betrayal. The evening rain fell upon Brussels with the persistence of tears for ancient sorrows, turning the cobblestones around St. Lugardus into mirrors that reflected both gaslight and the deeper shadows of human conscience. Brown stood in the cathedral presbytery, watching as Colonel Zimmerman passed before the window with the measured gait of a man wrestling with obligations that pulled his soul in opposite directions. The investigation cannot continue indefinitely, Zimmerman said, his voice carrying the weight of military necessity. tempered by scholarly reluctance. My superiors grow impatient with what they perceive as unnecessary delay in resolving a simple matter of a missing person. Simple matters, Father Brown observed, mildly have a curious tendency to become complex when examined closely, rather like medieval manuscripts. Say more carefully one studies them, the more layers of meaning reveal themselves. The colonel turned from the window, his pale eyes reflecting something between appreciation and exasperation. Your investigation has been thorough, Father, perhaps too thorough for military preferences. What conclusions have you reached, Father? Brown settled himself in a chair that had likely served generations of clerics facing difficult decisions. I have reached several conclusions, though I confess they raise as many questions as they answer. Would you care to hear them, please? First, Father Brown began counting off points on his fingers. With characteristic precision, Sister Marie Claire's disappearance was not the result of capture accident or conventional death. Second, the arrangement of artifacts in the crypt was deliberate and symbolic, intended to convey a specific message to those capable of interpreting it. Third, young Emma witnessed not a burial, but a ceremony of concealment. Fourth, Patheus's vision shower. One chooses to interpret their supernatural content, accurately describe the activities that have been occurring within the cathedral's hidden spaces. Colonel Zimmerman had grown very still during this recitation. And your fifth conclusion, thought, you, Colonel, have known far more about Sister Marie Claire's fate than your official position has permitted. Uto acknowledged the silence that followed this statement seemed to press against the presbytery's ancient walls like centuries of unspoken confessions. Zimmerman moved to his desk where his medieval architectural drawings lay scattered among military reports and correspondence. Knowledge, he said finally, can be both a blessing and a burden for a soldier, Father, particularly Cleed, that conflicts with duty. Indeed, though I suspect your conflict runs deeper than simple military obligations. Father Brown paused, studying the colonel's face. With Gina Leoton Shenyo, research into St. Ludgard's history provided you with unique insight into the cathedral's Stradian role as sanctuary. When Sister Marie Claire's activities came to your attention, you found yourself facing a choice between enforcing occupation law and respecting Jekyllistist tradition. Zimmerman's hand moved unconsciously toward one of his architectural sketches, a detailed drawing of the cathedral's underground passes. As Sister Marie Claire's network was remarkably sophisticated, he admitted quietly, her use of the cathedral's medieval sanctuary spaces showed both desperation and remarkable historical knowledge she could have acquired only with assistance from someone well-versed in the building's architecture. Yes, the word seemed to cost the colonel considerable effort. Our initial investigation revealed that she had been using Thinsian crypt passages to shelter wounded Allied soldiers. The network extended through several buildings connected by underground tunnels dating to the 13th century. Father Brown nodded slowly, and when the investigation grew too close to discovery, Sister Mary Claire requested a meeting. Zimmerman continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She proposed a solution that would satisfy military requirements while preserving the sanctuary traditions that had protected the innocent for centuries. She proposed to stage her own death. More precisely, she proposed to disappear in such a manner that official law courts could declare her deceased while the reality remained ambiguous. Colonel moved to the window again, watching the rain create patterns on the glass that resembled tears. The photograph in the crypt was her idea, a message to those who needed to know that her work continued while providing official investigators with evidence of her demise. Father Brown absorbed this revelation with characteristic count thou. His mind was rapidly connecting the final elements of the puzzle. And you assisted in this deception. I provided the architectural knowledge necessary to create a convincing crime scene. Zimmerman admitted my understanding of medieval burial practices, ensured that the arrangement would appear authentic to cursory investigation, while conveying deeper meaning to those initiated into the cathedral's true purpose, a scholarly devotion to an ancient tradition of sanctuary perhaps, or perhaps simply theicision of a man who found himself unable to prosecute compassion as if it were a crime. The colonel's reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a face marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from serving causes that war with conscience safer. Brown considered the implications of this confession, recognizing in it the complex moral landscape that Wadham often created for men of principle. The current arrangement serves multiple purposes. He observed official records show Sister Marie Claire as deceased, satisfying military requirements. The resistance network believes she has been inspiring continued service, and the reality Zimmerman completed is that she continues her work from within the cathedral's hidden spaces, tending to wounded souls who officially not exist, supported by a community that officially believes her dead. An elegant solution to an impossible situation. Elegant perhaps, but temporary. Colonel turned back to face this Father Brown. Directly, my superiors have ordered a complete structural survey of the cathedral. German engineers will stone every passage, every hidden space, any ongoing sanctuary act. But as it will be discovered within days, the weight of this revelation settled over the presbytery like the accumulation of centuries. Father Brown understood that the ancient game of sanctuary and pursuit, which had protected the innocent since medieval times, was approaching its modern conclusion. The very thoroughness that made Sister Mary Claire's deception effective would soon make it impossible to maintain. How long do we have, Father? Brown asked quietly. 2 days. Zimmerman replied. Perhaps 3, if the weather delays. The engineering team's Father Brown rose from his chair with sudden decision, understanding that the mystery he had been called to was transforming into a moral crisis that demanded action. Rather than mere understanding, the ancient walls of Estlet Goddess had sheltered the suffering for 9 centuries, but they were about to face their greatest test, whether the traditions of sanctuary could survive the methodical scrutiny of modern warfare. As he prepared to leave the presbytery, Father Brown reflected that some mysteries could only be resolved through choice rather than deduction. That question was no longer what had happened to Sister Mary Claire, but what would happen to the continuing tradition, affirmacy that her apparent sacrifice had been designed to preserve ate the truth in stone and spirit. Dawn broke over Brussels with the pale reluctance of a penitent approaching confession, and Father Brown found himself standing once again before the opened crypt beneath the bishop's throne. But this time, he was not alone in seeking truth among the ancient bones. Beside him stood Colonel Zimmerman, Promotius, and young Emile, each representing a different strand of the mystery that had woven itself around Sister Marie Claire's disappearance. What they were about, witness, would challenge every assumption they had made about the nature of death, service, and the eternal struggle between law and mercy. The German engineers arrived at noon. Zimmerman said quietly, his scholarly excitement now tempered by genuine concern for consequences beyond his control. Whatever resolution we attempt must be completed by then. Father Brown nodded, though his attention was focused on a subtle sound, echoing from the cathedral's depths, a rhythm so faint it might have been mistaken for the settling of ancient stones, but which his experienced ear recognized. A something far more significant. Per Matthias, he said gently, our visions spoke of white, robed figures tending to invisible wounded. I believe the time has come to make the invisible visible. The old sacristanses widened with understanding, mixed with trepidation. You wish to disturb this sanctuary of the blessed dead? On the contrary, Father Brown replied with a slight smile. I wish to reveal the sanctuary of the blessed living. Before Arian could question this cryptic statement, Father Brown approached the crypt opening and spoke in a voice that carried clearly into the underground passages. Sister Mary Claire, I believe it is time for resurrection. The silence that followed seemed to stretch through centuries, until gradually, a new sound emerged from the depths. The soft whisper of robes against stone, accompanied by the careful footsteps of someone moving through familiar darkness. A figure in white appeared at the edge of the crypt opening, and Sister Marcla Dubois climbed gracefully into the chancel of Slutgardy Cathedral. She was alive unmistakably and radiant, though her appearance bore the marks of weeks spent in underground spaces. Her Red Cross uniform had been replaced by simple white robes that made her seem like a figure from Palm. Matthias's visions and her face showed the particular serenity that comes to those who have found their true calling. Despite impossible circumstance, Banya Mayor, she said to Father Brown with calm dignity, "I confess, I have been expecting this conversation, as have I," Father Brown replied gently, "though I admit that timing remained uncertain until Colonel Zimmerman explained the urgency of our situation." Emil stepped forward with the impulsive loyalty of childhood, positioning himself protectively beside Sister Mary Claire. "She saved my life," he said fiercely, "and the lives of many others. If the Germans want to arrest her, they must arrest Meswell's sister." Marie Claire placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Emil Emerov, your protection has been invaluable, but this moment requires different kinds of courage." "Indeed," Father Brown agreed, "the courage to trust that truth, however complex, serves justice better than comfortable deceptions." Colonel Zimmerman had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the bearing of a man who had reached a decision that will define his character, regardless of its consequences. "Sister Markler," he said formally, "according to official German records, you died 3 weeks ago. A death certificate has been filed, and military investigation concluded. As far as Miss Superiors are concerned, this case is closed. And yet, here I stand." Sherplight with gentle irony, "Here you stand." Zimmerman confirmed, "But not a Sister Marie Claire Dubois, Red Cross, nurse and suspected enemy collaborator. Woman died officially and completely. The woman before us is someone else entirely, perhaps a lay sister attached to this cathedral, perhaps a volunteer who assists Patius with his sacred duties." Father Brown watched this exchange with growing admiration for the colonel's capacity to find solutions that honored both duty and conscience, a bureaucratic resurrection. He observed the dead remain dead in official records, while the living find new ways to serve. "Precisely," Zimmerman said, "my architectural survey will conclude that the cathedral's underground passages are structuralized but historically insignificant medieval storage areas of no contemporary relevance. Any wounded soldiers currently sheltering in those places will regrettably be classified as German deserters seeking sanctuary other than Allied escapees, requiring capture." Sister Marie Claire's ice-reflected understanding of the elegant complexity of this solution end. "My work, your work," Permittus interjected with sudden clarity, "becomes part of the cathedral's traditional ministry to the suffering, as it always was, as it always should be." Father Brown nodded, slowly recognizing in this resolution the same pattern that had protected sanctuary seekers for centuries, not through direct defiance of authority, but through the creative interpretation of law that allowed mercy to flourish within the boundaries of official compliance. "There remains one practical matter," he said, "the photograph and the evidence of your death must be preserved to maintain the official fiction." "The photograph remains," Sister Marie Claire agreed, "along with the bones of Bishop Honorauf, who understood that healing the wounded transcends political boundaries. Let it stand as testimony that some traditions are too sacred to die, even when their practitioners must occasionally appear to do so." Colonel Zimmerman gathered his architectural drawings with brisk efficiency. "My report will be filed this afternoon," he said. "It will conclude that while Sister Marcla Dubois tragically perished during the investigation, the cathedral itself possessed no security concerns and may continue its normal religious functions without further military oversight." Young Emil looked up, at Sister Marie Claire with the bright understanding of childhood grasping adult complexities. You will still care for 200 soldiers. I will care for all who suffer, she replied, simply German. Allied or civilian pain recognizes no nationality, and mercy acknowledges no borders, as the group prepared to separate, each returning to roles that were both the same and transformed by their shared understanding. Father Brown reflected on the peculiar nature of mysteries that solved themselves through revelation rather than detection. The truth about Sister Mary Claire had not required investigation so much as recognition, the recognition that some forms of service were to impotanto be interrupted by death, whether real or carefully staged. The Cathedral of Sludgardus settled back into its ancient rhythm of prayer and sanctuary, its damaged stones bearing witness to another chapter in the eternal story. Aftos, who choose mercy over law, service over safety, and love over the countless lesser loyalties that divide human hearts in the crypt beneath. The bishop's thrown medieval bones and a modern photograph continued their silent testimony to the truth that healing and hope could survive any war, outlast any occupation, and transform any apparenting into a new beginning. The mystery was solved, but the greater mystery, how ordinary people found the courage to become saints in the most unlikely circumstances, remained as profound and inspiring. Aseva, thanks for joining us for the Bones of the Bishop. Did you suspect that Sister Marie Claire had staged her own death before? Father Brown revealed the truth about the sanctuary. Network Lit. Me know your thoughts in the comments if you enjoyed this wartime adventure with Father Brown. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember, Father Brown's wisdom, the greatest. Mysteries often lie not in what appears to be lost, but in what chooses to remain hidden until the moment is right for revelation. Sometimes the most profound truth is that apparent endings can become the most meaningful beginnings. Asterisk.